welcome to the questions and answers part for our combined session on labor and gender. First, two questions. First, is the definition of labor that wide that studying would be a part of it as an example for non-wage labor? It's not so easy to answer this question because what counts as work or as labor is always contested, and there is no universally acknowledged definition of labor or work. And there's always the danger of excluding stuff from it that shouldn't be included, or of including stuff that should not be included. For example, probably if we just define it in a very wide sense and say, well, work or labor is human activity that takes time and effort, then you could argue, well, getting up out of bed, that's already work. And probably we wouldn't want to say that getting up out of bed in the morning should be considered work, I guess at least. And then you could also define it very, very narrowly and then say, well, we define it for work that is wage labor, and then all the activities that are not paid fall out of the definition of work and labor. For example, the care work. And then you can, of course, try to define it another way and say, well, it has to be an effort that's taken to fulfill certain human needs. And then the question is, whose human needs? And then is cooking in the kitchen of a restaurant, that's probably work or labor. Cooking just for yourself in the evening because you enjoy it so much, maybe not. Cooking for you and your family, if you really don't want to at the moment, someone has to do it, possibly. So it's not really easy. And the bottom line, what I want to say is that in the end, it's also always a cultural question. It's always a question of what is acknowledged as labor in a certain society or in a certain context. Next question is a little bit more specific, and maybe it also helps answering the first question. So here the question goes, what is the difference between labor and labor power? Okay, and then the question is on, and what is Marx's labor theory of value? Could you explain it, please? So let's first stick with the first half of this question. What's the difference between labor and labor power? So labor power is a much more specific term, and labor power typically refers to a certain amount of capacity to do labor, which means that you could either refer to a person that's working for wage as someone who's selling their labor power to their employer. You could also say, well, if we take all the work that the people that work for this factory together, then that's the total labor power that's employed there. Or you can say, well, all the people that are on the job market in Germany, that's the total amount of labor power on the German stock market, German job market. The term labor can mean more things. Sometimes the term labor is simply used as a shorthand for labor power, and then you can also see, well, there is a lack in supply of labor on the German labor market. Then you would mean exactly the same thing that I just described before as labor power. However, labor also means other things. Labor can simply mean a certain task that you have to perform. So right now I have to perform the labor of recording this questions and answers session here. Thirdly, labor can also refer to a social force or a political force, and then you typically speak of the opposition between capital and labor. And then capital is not understood as the total amount of money and machinery that capitalists have or companies have, but rather as the sum of all companies as political actors or as actors in the political sphere, whereas labor is then seen as a representation of workers in the political sphere. So typically you think of them, so when you talk of labor in this sense, you think of labor unions. When you talk about capital in this sense, you think of business associations, and then there might be some parties that are political parties that represent labor, while others represent capital. But today, parties often try to represent both of them. What is Marx's labor theory of value? It's hard to do it justice, but just one among many questions here. So I'll just make it really short. So the idea of Marx's labor theory of value is that the value that a certain product or commodity has can be measured as the amount of labor time that is necessary to produce it under certain social circumstances. And the more labor time is necessary to produce a thing, the higher its value is. This does not mean that the slower and less efficient you work, the more the stuff that you put out is worth. It means the more it would take the average producer in a society to produce it, the more is it is worth. And then it becomes complicated. I'll just leave it there for now. Google it, you'll find better explanations. Next, first of all, you said that wages are increasing less than productivity is increasing. However, you did not elaborate on it. I was wondering if a higher increase in productivity than wages is normal or is it a problem? So maybe first as a short explanation. So productivity means the output of value that can be done by a certain amount of labor. So let's say the average German worker works for 1 hour and thereby he produces, let's say, 50 euro worth of goods. So then that's the productivity is 15 euros per working hour, very, very roughly. And as companies get more effective because they have more effective machinery or more effective organization of the work processes, then workers get more effective and more productive. This is one thing, and then the other question is how much do the workers receive for the 1 hour of work, which should typically be less than the value of goods they produce, because otherwise the companies could not survive and the investors could not earn profits. So the both variables are connected somehow, yet there is no necessary connection that if one goes up, the other has to go up. So typically the output has to be lower than the wage. However, if the productivity grows, the wages can grow as quickly. They might even grow quicker until the margin of profits comes too close to zero. But it can also be that the productivity rises and the wages do not rise. And the question is this normal? And this is a very tricky question. It has been quite normal for the last 50 or so years in almost all Western countries. So you can say, well, yeah, that is normal. If you take a longer perspective, then you can at least say it's not always the case, and other developments have been there. Then the question is, what do we do with this, and is this a problem? And the question whether it's a problem depends on who you are. If you are living on wages, then it's a problem because you earn less money than you would earn otherwise. If you own a company and live on capital income, then it's not a problem, but it's quite a sweet deal because your profits increase because of that. And so that's not a logical question or something like that, but it's the question of who gets what. And then with certain economic approaches, you can say, well, this might be a problem because lower wages means that there will be less demand on the market, and this is the case if you believe that workers will use more of their income for consumption because they will just buy more stuff if their income is higher, while if the companies have higher income or the investors and stock owners have higher profits, they will not use this money for consumption, but rather save the money or reinvest the money. And if they don't reinvest it to buy more machinery, then there could be a lack in demand, and this could cause problems in capitalism. But it's not so clear cut that you can simply say it will cause problems. In what extent does international labor division affect state sovereignty? What does this affect politics negatively? This has something to do with what we discussed in session 7 and with these trilemmas that we have there. To make it really short, in a globalized world where there's more international division of labor, countries are competing with one another as places of production. So if you want to keep your industries in your country, you have to make sure that you're productive or that you that the production costs in your country are competitive as compared to other countries. And this of course means that as a country it might be bad for you to engage in policies that will increase wages by empowering unions or by raising minimum wages, or in other kinds of ways where you could strengthen the position of labor or make labor more expensive. This might mean that a company simply says, well, I take my investment elsewhere where I can produce for less money. So this means that governments have effectively fewer choices in policy. So this is an argument where they don't formally use sovereignty, but materially they have fewer chances to make use of their sovereignty. However, there is some merit to this argument, but you should not use this or let this be used as an excuse for governments not to do anything for wages and for workers and so on, because the governments themselves, they can also to some degree control how mobile capital is and how globalized the world is. So I already explained this a couple of weeks ago. This is no fate that happens to governments. Governments are very much engaged in the very process of fostering globalization. So they shouldn't be considered victims there, at least not all of them. Some of them certainly do not have a choice here. Doesn't a real structural change of bad working conditions and unequal distribution of labor over the globe become more unlikely or very unlikely, seeing that this would require social movements while the conditions of those concerned are so bad, precarious, vulnerable and constrained due to the further global externalization process that they have no chance to stand up against them? Vicious circle. If people have no assurance and they're insecure workplaces, they will not dare to strike or protest because they would cost them job. Can't we rather observe that social movements came rather from Western countries like Occupy? We are the 99%. Yes and no, I would say. So yes, the dynamics that I just described concerning state sovereignty also affect trade unions in many different ways. If you, for example, think of Bangladeshi textile workers, they certainly have good reasons to wish for higher wages and more workplace safety regulations and so on and so on. So they do want that and they should want that. However, they also have an interest in keeping the textile production in their country. So you could argue if their demands are too high and this will drive production costs up too much, this would mean that investors leave the country and then they have no job at all. So their higher workplace safety will not help them any if they don't have a workplace at all. Of course, this puts pressure on them in the form of incentives. And also, this whole international division of labor means that companies not only have it easier to deal with trade unions, because trade unions have incentives to engage in international competition and keep their labor cheaper. It also means that company can simply go to places where trade unions are fought effectively by the government. So if the government wants to have a lot of industry in the country, they might have an incentive to prohibit union activities, and companies can make use of it and do make use of it. So you're right that the whole international division of labor and globalization process makes it more difficult for labor to organize, and this is so. However, it's not that it does not happen, and it's not that it's impossible. So if I take the example that you gave there, I would say yes, Occupy was a movement, and there was a lot you heard about this in the media. However, compared to other social movements of recent years, it was rather minuscule, and that you heard of this and not heard of the others does not mean that the others don't exist. It just means that Western media discourse is focused on struggles that happen in Western societies. So just to give one example, in January of 2019, there was a strike in India with 150 million workers participating in this one strike. So this is roughly twice the population of Germany, and this was sometimes said to be the biggest strike in the history of mankind. Yet, this probably was only a very small notice in most German newspapers or in German TV news, and might not even have popped up in others. So the reporting about workers' struggles in other countries is very, very limited. So that means that not knowing them does not mean they do not exist. And if you want to know them, you have to follow media that will focus on these struggles. Okay, so much. Isn't it a bit of an understatement to say that these social movements have better chances if others in society act in solidarity? Because if there was no solidarity at all, there would be no chance for change at all. Once again, I'd say yes and no. So at very first, all social movements are built on solidarity, in the sense that a social movement cannot exist as something that just means adding many individuals together, and those individuals remain individuals and just happen to have the same interest. They have to organize collectively. So if every single worker in a certain company just individually negotiates their own contracts, this means that some will have very good contracts and others will not, and this strengthens the position of the company. On the other hand, if all these workers organize, then they will have a much better collective bargaining position than the employer has, and this will typically strengthen the position of those that would have particularly bad chances in the negotiation process. So that solidarity you definitely need. When it comes to solidarities from other actors, I would say, is this important? Yes, absolutely. Is it the case that social movements cannot have any success without others being solidaric or acting in solidarity with them? I wouldn't necessarily say that. So particularly when it comes to organizations of workers, their discursive pressure is one important element, but if all the pilots of a certain airline just act collectively and go on strike, the whole media can be against them, and all other workers can be against them and say, well, those rich guys up there, why do they strike? And they would still have quite a good negotiating position. So it depends a bit, and something similar in a weaker sense can also be said for other employees as well. So just if those that are affected have an important structural position in production, they already instantly have a lot of negotiating power. If, however, for example, you as students go on strike, that probably won't impress anyone that much, because you don't have any power in the sense of we're not studying and now we're hurting the economy. No, you're not. It just means that I have more leisure time. The next two questions are critical of what I did, and particularly of what I didn't say, and they go like this. So first, where are the women? A somewhat critical question, or better note, sorry for that, don't be sorry. But I have a strong opinion on this topic. I was a little frustrated that gender approaches take up so little space in the current lecture, because I am convinced that this is an essential discussion with regards to international unequal employment relationships, etc. Doesn't that also represent the global problem that these structures, human trafficking, slavery, discrimination, and the acknowledgement of gender hierarchies receive so little, too little attention in science? I'm aware that it was a 2-in-1 lecture, but could you maybe elaborate a bit more on the topic? Second, from a different person, in my opinion, the slide on some gender-related concepts reproduces the impression of the gender problematic being only of secondary importance, particularly the last row of the table with many, many more, and C in textbook conveys the impression that it is not relevant to agree that more elaborations would be needed. Okay, first, thanks for those two questions. And I'd say you're right, in at least in the sense that much more could and should be said about gender-related questions here. What I can do is I can explain why it was in the lecture like it was, and what I would do differently after reading the questions. So I absolutely agree with you that questions of gender are absolutely important in the economy in general, in political economy, and in international political economy. My problem with addressing it was, when preparing lecture, that I had a much harder time of locating it and finding a single starting point. The topic of, let's say, financial markets or global finance was certainly not an easier topic, but it was much easier for me to find a starting point, because you can simply say, well, these are financial markets and this is their role in international political economy. And something similar can be said for foreign direct investment, and so on and so on. With gender, however, the fact is that you find it everywhere you look in IPE if you look closely, but there is not this one place where the place of gender is. So I had problems finding just like this one good starting point, and I did not want to start by repeating the definition of gender or the distinction between sex and gender, because I hope that you heard that quite a couple of times in your studies, so I didn't want to spend too much time on that. In hindsight, what I think I would have done differently is that I would have been more explicit on what I just said, namely that it's difficult to find this one point, and that's everywhere, and that there are a lot of different aspects that equally deserve, or there are a lot of gender related aspects that equally deserve being part of the lecture, but then in the end I have to choose them, so I chose the one that were most strongly related to the other topic of the session, which was labor. Moreover, I also found that the textbook did a pretty good job on discussing human trafficking and sex work and these topics. So I found that me repeating this would not have added that much actually. So I don't know if you're satisfied, but that was my excuse so far, and I just go on by answering some more gender-related questions. Next one. In your discussion about the unequal division of labor, you point out that precarious and unpleasant jobs are outsourced to women and minorities. These populations often work in social care, kindergarten, or as healthcare workers, which, as you pointed out, become jobless or at least defunded in times of crisis. These jobs, it seems, in regard to a society, are essential but are often neglected. Therefore, I wondered how that comes about and whether this is related to the origin of these jobs and or the workers in these jobs. So there's a lot to be said here. Maybe first I start with that you can see this in a lot of different societies and economies, that those sectors of the economy where women work are typically the ones that are not held in the highest regard, and even more, they are not paid very well. And this, you can watch this statically and say at any given point in time this is typically the case, but you even see this as a development. So, and it even works in this way that if women start working in a certain sector more, then wages in the sector will decline relatively to other sectors. And so there are a lot of different dynamics here, and then there's also, which is not always the case in every sector, but in some sectors, particularly in the private sector, this is more the case in the public sector, you also see that women performing the very same jobs as men are paid less. And another point to which I referred to in the lecture, which you picked up here, is that if we, for example, think of manual factory work, then there's often, and there often has been, and there still is, this development or this relation that men more likely get full-time jobs with an indeterminate working contract, while women often work in part-time jobs with lower pay and with a shorter term contract, so that when then there is a crisis, the women are the one that lose the jobs. And sometimes you even hear employers justifying this by the idea that the male workers, they have to pay for their family, while the female workers, what they earn is just an extra income. So you hear this pattern of justification. And you find these kind of inequalities in many different ways, and typically you find both relations. So those jobs that are economically and when it comes to social recognition worth off are typically jobs where more women work, and also the other way around, when women work in a certain job, it's likely to receive less attention. And the question where this comes from and what's the chicken, what's the egg here, and why women keep on going into these jobs, you could also ask the question that way, is contested at least. But you also see this in public discourse. For example, in the 1990s in particularly, beginning before and stretching a bit further, the textile industry in Germany collapsed. And of all the manufacturing industries in Germany, the textile industry is one where there was a disproportionate share of female workers. And there was hardly any big public outcry that all these good factory jobs are disappearing. It just happened, and certain cities and communities that were built about around textile working, they lost their economic base. However, when let's say coal mining disappears, also for not very dissimilar reasons, and a similar amount of jobs disappear, then this is a big public topic, or a much bigger public topic, and they can once again ask, why is this so? Are these kind of jobs that deserve public attention, while the others are not? And it's I have a hard time explaining it because I think there is no good reason for it. It's just a cultural pattern that reproduces itself over and over again. Next question: can you show us more ways how gender justice can be achieved in the area of IPE? I think this is a very tricky question because, as I explained before, there is not this one point in IPE where gender is important and where you could just like put the lever and then change everything. It's kind of everywhere, and it seems that wherever you implement some reforms, then the gender equalities will pop up somewhere else. So I would say there is not this one place that you can address. It has to take the form of many different localized struggles. And the best general answer I would be able to give is that you always should be aware of the relevance of gender-related questions, and should be aware that it's relevant everywhere, and then you at least have a better chance of it becoming a topic of discussion. Regarding gender perspective, some researchers argue much of women's work fell outside the economy. Should the household work be included in the economy? And when the answer is yes, for what reasons? This is indeed a question that has been discussed or has been raised by feminist researchers for decades. And when you say fall out the economy, this only means, of course, the formal economy that's measured in euros and dollars or marks at the time. The criticism goes further and says, well, it's not that it falls outside the economy, but the very economy is based on this kind of work, and it could not work without, it could not function without women performing this kind of work. Yet then this work is not formally acknowledged as work, but just as something that women are supposed to do, and it's not paid work, and this leaves the women that perform this work in a very precarious situation. And the question whether from this you draw the conclusion that care work should be wage labor, this is kind of difficult, because then the question is, how do you address this? Does it mean that we stick with the traditional model of families where the father of the family works outside in the economy, the woman, the mother of the family, works inside the household, and then the father is obliged to pay the woman money for the work that she does. I'm not sure whether this would be the best way out. Similarly, if you say, well, we move away from the idea that just like work that is done for free in the household, and we also move away from the idea that women should be doing this, then it gets something that becomes something that is put out on the market, and then these globalized care chains that I mentioned in the lecture, then they evolve. So once again, I don't think there's just like this one magic bullet here, and that making this work, paid work, will really do the trick or will really work. The thing is that it should be at least acknowledged that this kind of work has to happen, that this work has no less dignity or important than real work that is out there in the economy, and that there's no natural reason that these tasks should be performed by women, and that they still are, and they still are in 2020, and that you are aware of these facts, and whatever you do, you try to do something about this problem, but there will not be the one reform that solves these problems. And I don't think transforming all care work for children and every activity of dishwashing into monetarized works will really do the trick here. Next, why wouldn't some call the seeing of unpaid care work from women as work emancipation? I would say to some degree many would agree that making it visible is emancipation. However, if it still means that women have to do the work and they get some money for it, is this really freedom or move towards freedom? And if we then move to a society after making this work become a work that people are paid for, if we then move to a world where we have female migrant workers performing this work, is this really something that we should name emancipation? I'm not really convinced here, but I will say that certainly for those women that had to do these kinds of tasks in households and now no longer have to do them, or whose mothers had to do them, now they don't have to do them, they certainly have more possibilities in life to choose from, and so they are freer than they or their mothers were before them. However, it cannot really be the solution yet, I would say, because it's still work that is done, it's still work that's done in hierarchies, and it's still work that's done by women, so this cannot be it. The idea that care work was previously done by Western white women and now it has been replaced by mostly immigrant women can be synthesized as a self-evolution and neoliberalization of capitalism itself, ? And if before Western women were the most stigmatized, now the immigrant ones are, who will be next? Okay, complicated question, complicated answer. So first I would say, if you say evolution means some sort of natural process that had to develop this way, I would say no, it's not evolution. It's the outcome of political struggles that could have gone other ways. If it were not for the women's movements to make the demands that they make, if it were not for capitalism taking a certain development, if it were not for certain regulations making migration easy enough, then this would not have happened, and there is no universal law that says that this is the way that it was bound to happen. However, if you say that's part of neoliberalization, I would say yes, you can make this case, because then it's not some sort of natural evolution, but then it's a very specific development And some even give this a specific name and call it progressive neoliberalism. Because in what is then called progressive neoliberalism, I might have mentioned that in an earlier lecture, then we have this idea that everyone is equal and women should be equal, and at the same time, well, the market relations should have a great place in society. And this then means that the richer women can get rid of these household works and they are free to become managers or CEOs, or probably not CEOs. That's something that women still cannot become that easily, but at least they can become something else than a mother. And then you can say, well, they are emancipated now, and this happens the way of the market, and then they also use the market to give those works to others, and these are also individuals that seek their own best interest. So you can say, yes, this means that capitalism and neoliberalism expanded and do their work here. So with the notion of evolution, I would be hesitant. However, if you define it right, you can also make the case. With the notion of neoliberalization, I would say, yes, that's what happened there. Next part of the question, I wouldn't say that Western women ever were the most stigmatized in Western societies. There were always groups that were below Western women in the social picking order, as I would say, and I would also not say that immigrant women per se are the most stigmatized groups in Western society these days. I would rather say this is limited to these certain work relations where there has been this shift, and I wouldn't make a general statement about who's the most stigmatized here. Last question, in which way did neoliberal economic policies have an impact on female poverty? I think there are a lot of ways that you can think of. I'll just give one example or one small argument. In general, in most countries, you can say that women are in the weaker economic position, and neoliberalization policies typically come at the cost of those who are in the weak position and help those who are in the strong positions. So women that were in a very strong economic position beforehand, they probably don't lose that much by neoliberal policies because they have the funds to buy all the goods and services they need, and so they probably get through this. However, if you are a single mother and then you are one of the people in society that has to rely on certain public social services, and if these social public services are cut, then you suffer more from that than those who do not need these services. And still we live in a society where a great majority of single parents are single mothers and not single fathers. So in these neoliberal policies, a single father who has very low income and low education would suffer from these policies the same way that a single mother with the same low income and the same low education would suffer. However, there simply are many more women who have this situation than there are men who have this situation, and therefore women suffer more from these kind of policies that will cut the services that single parents need. Okay, so much for today. I'm looking forward to seeing you next week when we discuss development, I guess. Bye.